Wonderful. This has been a really terrific panel, far-ranging discussions. A number of our talks really addressed ethical and societal questions that revolve around how we envision people plus AI together, whether it's communicating or working together, issues that revolve around things such as fairness, trust, equity, and others. So I want to start with a series of questions. Casper mentioned the AI alignment challenge. I'll maybe say this a little more anecdotally in terms of what can we do to help ensure that our advanced AI agents and systems behave consistently with human goals and human values. So I want to start with Simon. So we heard Sally mention there's a lot of activity at MIT around recommendations for AI policy and governance. You know, and you've mentioned there's a lot of discussion on AI policy and governance happening in the international community. You also acknowledged wage market disparities, and how can we think about policies to counteract that? So I'm curious, like, what are you thinking, or what are you hearing in terms of policy recommendations, both internationally and domestic, that can help present more of the optimistic outcomes that you mentioned in your talk?
Well, I think all of the other speakers gave really good examples of technologies that are being used, that can be developed further. For example, Sarah at the end there, and require some impetus, some additional funding, some prioritization. I think it's not hard to find those. The problem is, if you say the word regulation in a sentence with AI in Washington, D.C., a member of staff at the back of the room often says, China. And then everybody backs off because there's some sort of perception that regulatory frameworks or any government role in shaping this technology will concede some national security or competitive advantage to China, which I don't think is the case. But I think we have to get past that. And I think these are all very good specifics. Like, we could go more in this direction. We can develop a lot of new jobs doing the kinds of things Deb was talking about. For example, we can address the polarity issues that issue was talking about, and we absolutely have to confront the ethical issues. So it's a wide open field. It's fantastic potential. But are we going to come up with legislation or a legal framework or consumer protection or any of the other pieces that will be complementary to that? I think that's still to be determined.
All right, work to be done. All right, Deb, my next question is for you. So we have elections coming up. I know there's a lot of concern about generative AI and the spread of misinformation and deepfakes and so forth. So I guess my first question for you is, looking at this next election and maybe then thinking further out elections, are you more worried or optimistic about generative AI in democracy?
Yeah, as I mentioned briefly in my remarks, there is, I think, a legitimate reason for worry in terms of the near costless ability to create bullshit at scale. And we have a lot of habits and a lot of institutions that are grounded in habits that are not prepared for this kind of tsunami, which is already washing over us. So I think there is going to be a fair amount of disruption and confusion that is already underway. And just to give you one example, it's not with elections, but just what I consider an important democratic process, the process of public comment. So when the federal government is considering a new rule, there'll be a period of public comment where the rule is put out. And I have talked to federal regulators who, in skimming through the thousands of public comments that come in for a comment for a particular rule change, suddenly realize they're not sure whether these were generated by generative AI controlled by potentially one actor, designed to have very many different organic forms that all lead to the same objective. So this sort of thing is already happening, yeah, I would just say we have to acknowledge that. I think there's some interesting things that can be done short term. The social media platforms, some of them are adopting policies where if you use generative AI in political ads, you have to disclose that. I don't know how much that disclosure, what the impact will be on the end audience. There's interesting research questions ahead, but the experiment is happening real time. I think, though, the positive side, I gave some specific examples, but there are many others that we and my colleagues are exploring in the ability to understand those laws better. Most of us don't speak legalese or the language of policy wonks, but generative AI can do an incredible job in translating a law or a rule that would affect my life, but I actually don't understand what it means. For that matter, I'm sometimes trying to figure out MIT policies and procedures, and I can't figure out where to look or what they mean and what this will, and I think generative AI can help. So in many ways, when I look at the longer time horizon, there's a lot of positive possibilities, but immediate disruption has arrived.
Great, thank you. All right, my next question is for Casper. So you spoke about agentic AI. So ChatGPT, other conversational agents, as we know, present themselves as social agents, right? They convey, they have mental states through language, but they're not human. And of course, we don't think they actually have these mental states. However, when we talk about human intelligence, we naturally will try to make sense of their behavior in terms of mental states that we assume are like ours, right? So there's already kind of this mismatch, I think, in our expectations and our model. So pulling you back to kind of the here and now, when we talk about human-agent collaboration, how should we be thinking about these mental states or the ethical questions around fostering appropriate trust with such systems, given there are opportunities and risks for misalignment and so forth?
I guess my recommendation would be not to trust them. In other words, if we have a situation in which, if there's a situation in which we've given a human a certain amount of power, and we're giving them that kind of power because we're trusting that their desires align with ours, and they're going to act as we would want them to act in implementing their power, I would be very, very, very cautious indeed about giving any AI such power in anything like the medium-term future. And that's particularly if the underlying operations of the AI is that the AI is trying to optimize some function. So long as the AI is trying to optimize some function, it doesn't matter what kind of function it is, its desires are going to be radically misaligned with ours. And so, absolutely, in the medium term, I don't trust those things.
All right. You heard it here. So, Sarah, continuing on this topic of trust, especially in your domain, can we really trust AI to help make us decisions, especially in these very fast-moving domains like climate? How do you think about leveraging the role of AI systems that need to be trained on large data, given this counterbalance of things are rapidly changing? Yeah, how do you think about that?
I'm really with you in that AI is potentially something that can help us, that can help experts make decisions faster, but I don't think AI should be making decisions today, at least not in the domains that I operate in. And that's also, again, it's very difficult in the complexity of something like an ecosystem, which is always in flux, always changing, and where there are a lot of different actors, to actually understand what the sort of correct prioritization should be, particularly because there's still so much we don't understand. So I really see AI as a tool to help experts make decisions, maybe are at a broader scale or more rooted in data, but absolutely not as something that could even come close to replacing those experts. Just a sort of, I guess, anecdote along those lines. I do some work in Africa. I was just recently at Kruger National Park, which is a very complex and sort of long-standing, one of the oldest national parks in the world in South Africa. And there is this incredibly complex dichotomy of conservation actors. And there's currently basically a big fight between the tree conservationists and the elephant conservationists, where the idea is basically the people who are working on trees and forests. So like the elephants are knocking down our trees, Because they do. Elephants are ecosystem actors. They actually change the ecosystem around them. They manage the forest. They knock down the trees to generate more grassland, which provides more food for elephants. Elephants' natural predators have been pretty much removed in this area due to overhunting. So there is a growth in the elephant population, and as a result, more trees are being knocked down. And then the vulture conservationists are like, well, the elephants are knocking down the biggest trees, and so we actually need to make sure to be culling a certain % of the elephant population every year, because we want to make sure that we're not knocking down too many trees so the vultures still have habitat. But then it gets even more complicated, because this in South Africa is a place where you can still hunt big game. And so you can charge $1 million a bullet to shoot an elephant. And so now there's this question of who is pushing for the sort of conservation need to kill off some of the elephants. And then the real kicker is that the reason that there's a forest in this part of South Africa in the first place is because about 200 years ago, a massive epidemic wiped out a bunch of the impala, the local deer population, which meant that the small seedlings of the trees grew faster into larger trees, and then you actually got a forest. If you go back 200 years, there was no forest in the area. And actually one of the only consistencies in ecosystems is change. And so then when we think about making decisions, what do we want to preserve, what do we want to protect? Are we trying to keep the world in some sort of like snow globe, where we want to keep it the same all the time? Or do we want to figure out what are the mechanisms that let it change beneficially? This is incredibly complicated. I don't even think we have an AI system that could even start thinking about how to address this question. And it's something where really we need to make sure, and I think the most important thing is that each of the actors and each of the experts in the room has access to the same power of technology, the same methodological way to get information at scale, so that we're not basically giving more power to potentially actors that might be more frequently having access to large resources already, and giving them basically more ammunition to influence decision making in ways that might have sometimes hidden motivations, like making a lot of money off of big game hunting. It's really complicated.
It's complicated.
And AI should not, humans barely make these decisions effectively. AI should not be doing it.
Guess that
Yes.
kind of responding to both
Please.
these. And then there's the reality that millions of people are using ChatGPT to decide what to eat, where to travel, et cetera. And when you look at the kind of hyper-local decision-making that affects climate change, it's actually where the needle moves the most.
Yeah.
And the trust, unfortunately, is there, and decisions are being made. So just a editorial comment in response to both of your.
Absolutely.
We maybe shouldn't trust AI, but we are.
But we do. So, Asha, so thinking through your presentation on how can we ensure more equal opportunity and resources, you presented this idea of algorithmic plurality and structural equal opportunity. So what do you see are the biggest barriers to be able to achieving that right now, and how can we address them?
I enjoyed hearing Sarah's story, because it really just hones in on the fact that there are a variety of values that we all hold to varying degrees in any context. There's no really right answer, but there's the power to make a decision about what those trade-offs should be. And we can hand that over to certain developers, or we can have other frameworks for decision making. And I bring that up because I do think that there are competing values, even in centering, for example, or highlighting one value like equal opportunity with other values in any given context, which will guide kind of what interventions should be considered for any given context. But what I will say is, what the concern is that there is a concentration in decision-making power. And in some sense, that's really good, because, or that there is a possible concentration. In some sense, that could be good, because that roots out all kind of the variance that we tend to think of as really, really bad. But it also, again, creates the situation where you can have systemic failures. And so to what extent we can even peer into what's going on and understand to what extent that concentration is happening is a really interesting, I think, research question. I mean, it has to deal with auditing and all these other things. How can we actually understand how this is impacting real people? And you know, there's privacy concerns. There's a lot of other values that one needs to consider. And so this is all to say that it's a complex matrix of problems, but even just kind of laying out just the basic framework is a good start. And so, yeah, I've been doing that in my group.
Thank you. That leads into my next question. So I like to call this panel the Eyes Wide Open panel. And part of Eyes Wide Open is being able to think critically on our own favorite ideas and proposals, to think about what might be the trade-offs or the unintended consequences, how we might monitor that to kind of keep us on the path of the outcomes we hope to aspire. So I just want to invite the panel to think about that in relation to their presentation today, and how would you think about potential long-term consequences in terms of what might not go quite the way you had hoped, and how you think about mitigating or trying to monitor that. So so in terms of policies and regulation, like how might you think about the unintended consequences and how to safeguard against that?
Well, Sarah's got us all thinking about elephants and trees, which is very healthy. And I think that's a really interesting microcosm, because AI can certainly help Sarah manage the data, work with a lot of scientists, understand this, apply human judgment. So that's AI augmenting the humans, right? Now, the question is, what does this do for plumbers or electricians or modern craft workers or nurses? If it's something like what Sarah is deploying, if we can imagine that for these other jobs at other income levels or other skill levels, other levels of education, then we're onto something really big, Cynthia, right? Because then it's not just human in the loop, it's the human is making the decisions, but better informed and better able to understand all the pieces. And I really think that's possible. I really think that technology can be invented. But at the same time, what we're seeing is part of what Asha was talking about, part of what Deb's talking about, and there's a lot of forces using AI to go in a different direction. And you know, there are fast food companies that have announced that they are replacing the human order taking, for example, through drive-through with an AI, right? So whether or not that's a good idea, technically we could discuss, but you can see what that does to certain kinds of jobs, and those are not the best jobs to start with. People get pushed down out of jobs like that, and they have to compete with other people in other jobs which people have less expertise and less compensation. That's the job market polarization that we've seen over the past 40 years. But AI could be different if people listen to my colleagues here in terms of what the technology actually can deliver and connect that with, I mean, let's face it, it has to be scalable, it has to be a business, it has to be profit in it, right? This is America.
Sarah, what do you think about possible unintended consequences of the work that you do and how to safeguard against that?
Well, like I said, we know that our models are terrible at identifying species that are rare, right? And one of, I think, the real potential dangers of any system that uses AI is a lack of understanding of how the biases in the initial data are propagating to the predictions made by the model or to the generative sort of suggestions made by the model. And so I think one of the best things we can do to safeguard against that is really dig in and build much better research and sort of the making it easier for users to understand how the decisions are being made or understand things about the initial data that was used to train the model and how that might then propagate into downstream predictions. And I think a lot of that is like maybe even thinking about how we can use things like generative AI or AI-based teaching to start building more AI intuition and AI skepticism in a really informed way. Help people understand what should we expect AI to do, and what is kind of this overblown hype that's maybe being sold by companies or people who are trying to sell you something about what they think AI can do, and then help people understand within the context of what they want to use AI for, what are the major risks, and how might what AI is good at and what AI is bad at fall into those risks. I think we, just as a general public, need a lot more intuition about when and how and in what cases we should trust AI and when we should probably fall back on a human decision maker. And I think it's something we're actually pretty good at. Like when you think about all of you, if you've ever used ChatGPT, you very, very quickly learn how to interact with the system to get it to do what you want. But that's harder when we're fully automating something, where it's not just like a human, it's not like a high precision problem where you have a human in the loop doing correction and verification for every single prediction. When we start scaling to things like the healthcare example that Arsha brought up, where there's actually decisions being made that are completely systematically failing in a way that we might not pick up, or an expert might not pick up, because they're not seeing the system at scale, they're seeing individual decisions. I don't know if you have any other thoughts about that.
No, it's a great point. Cosign.
Excellent. So we're nearing time. So in a moment of reflection on what the panel has heard, what can we as MIT do specifically? What do we need to prioritize? What do you feel is our kind of unique contribution to help ensure a beneficial future with AI, with generative AI, that can bring about meaningful, fulfilling work for all people, for shared economic prosperity, for living in harmony with ourselves and our planet? Like, what would you advise us as the MIT community to do to help do that? Maybe I'll start with Casper as a philosopher. What can philosophers do?
That's a large question. I mean, I want to moderate what I said with also the question of whether the degree to which we offload our decision-making on these AIs, it's also got to be moderated by the thought that we actually like offloading decision-making. Decision-making is a costly thing mentally, psychologically, and it involves taking a certain kind of responsibility. And people, quite understandably, like not to do it. And so one area in which AI can be beneficial in decision-making is precisely so long as we can trust it not to go radically wrong in taking a certain kind of mental burden off ourselves. I mean, it's why consultancy firms make their business, right? It's because there is people like offloading decision-making. And so something I think can be very helpful would be a situation in which we have decision-making AI that's operating within constrained boundaries and such that we can trust it to make decisions for us, and we're happy to live with the results of those decisions precisely because we don't then have to make them. I'm sure that's why people are trusting ChatGPT to, where to go to lunch. It's because you don't want to decide where to go to lunch. It's a pain every day to have to make the decision where to go to lunch. You can offload that, that's great. And this is a marvelous function.
Wonderful. Asha, I want to give you the final weigh in here. What should we as MIT do to help ensure a beneficial future with AI?
Well, AI is a tool. You can use it to whatever end you would like. And I think MIT, this community, has a commitment to design tools for us for a plurality of people. And so I think having a mindfulness about who you're designing for and what you're designing is great. I mean, sometimes you're intrinsically limited by compute and a lot of other practicalities, and I think that is also a threat. The fact that we can't actually design end-to-end our own systems, but are left kind of trying to access these systems that exist in the ether. But I do think that that is a big part of our responsibility coming from the plurality person. So I'll end there.
Yes, wonderful. Thank you all. This has been a terrific panel. Thank you for all the thought-provoking discussion. Thank you.